Thousands gathered in Tehran for the funerals of dozens of police and security personnel killed following days of unrest. Authorities have not released an official civilian death toll.
What's happening in Iran right now is not a protest that can be managed, negotiated, or slowly contained. This is a massacre, and the regime knows it. That is why the response has crossed into outright slaughter. Security forces are not dispersing crowds, they are hunting them. Streets are being cleared with live gunfire. Entire districts are locked down, and the goal is no longer control, but terror. The leadership understands that once fear stops working, power collapses fast. So they are trying to flood the streets with fear again, using bullets instead of warnings. This is not restraint breaking down. This is a decision being executed at full speed because the regime believes that if it hesitates, it loses everything. Inside the country, the silence is engineered. The internet blackout has turned Iran into an information vacuum where truth leaks out only in short, unstable bursts. Messages appear for seconds, then vanish. Videos upload halfway and fail. Calls drop mid-sentence. Yet even through that darkness, the pattern is unmistakable. People describe crowds being mowed down without warning, gunfire erupting into unarmed groups, bodies left where they fall because ambulances cannot reach them. Clinics fill instantly, then overflow. One witness described carrying multiple bodies with their own hands before losing connection again. These are not clashes. These are executions carried out in public spaces to send a message faster than any broadcast ever could. That message is reinforced by state television itself. Parents are being warned not to let their children leave their homes, not because it is dangerous, but because if they are killed, there will be no right to complain. That is not a warning. It is a threat. It is the government announcing in advance that it will not be accountable for the deaths it causes. This is how mass killing is normalized. Responsibility is pushed onto families, and violence is reframed as an unavoidable consequence of disobedience. When a state prepares its people for death instead of protecting them from it, it is admitting that bloodshed is not accidental but planned. Despite the blackout, evidence from across the country keeps surfacing. Videos show rows of body bags, streets stained with blood, and industrial buildings turned into storage sites for the dead. Witnesses speak of dozens of bodies in single locations, with more hidden nearby because there is nowhere left to put them. Hospitals are overwhelmed so quickly that morgues fill within hours. Conservative estimates now say at least 2,000 people have been killed in roughly 44 hours. Other estimates go far higher. The exact number is impossible to confirm, and that uncertainty is intentional. When killing happens faster than counting, the state gains cover through chaos. To grasp how extreme this is, it must be compared to the past. In November 2019, protests over economic conditions led to about 1,500 deaths over an extended period. That month became known as the bloodiest crackdown in the country's modern history. What is happening now appears to have surpassed that number in a fraction of the time. This is not escalation by accident, it is escalation by design. The regime is acting as if time itself is the enemy, as if every hour without overwhelming force brings it closer to collapse. That urgency reveals how deeply threatened the leadership feels and how little restraint it believes it can afford. What makes this moment more dangerous than anything before is that fear has stopped working the way it used to. People are no longer waiting to see who wins before choosing a side. They are stepping into the streets knowing exactly what could happen and doing it anyway. That changes everything. The regime built its power on hesitation, on silence, on the belief that survival required obedience. That belief is cracking. Protesters are no longer hiding their faces or using coded language. They are speaking openly, showing themselves, calling out the leadership directly. When a population reaches that point, repression stops being a warning and becomes a gamble. Every bullet fired now risks creating 10 more people who feel they have nothing left to lose. The response from the state shows how clearly it understands this danger. Drones are now being flown over neighborhoods at night, circling above protests while recording faces from the air. This is not crowd control. This is preparation. By morning, security forces use that footage to raid homes, dragging people out of their beds before sunrise. Arrests are not random. They are targeted, calculated, and designed to decapitate local networks before they can grow. Reports indicate that at least 2,300 people have already been detained. In Iran's system, that number is terrifying. because arrest during unrest is often treated as proof of treason rather than a legal process. For many of those taken, arrest is not the end of the danger. Protesters are being labeled as enemies of God, a charge that carries the heaviest possible punishment. Once that label is applied, trials become meaningless formalities. Sentences are swift, outcomes are final. This is why families are desperate to hide their children, why entire neighborhoods go silent after nightfall. The threat is no longer just death in the street, it is disappearance. It is the fear that someone is taken away and never seen again, or returned only as a name whispered quietly because saying it out loud feels unsafe. The violence itself has escalated beyond street-level shootings. Snipers have reportedly been positioned on rooftops, firing into crowds from above. This method is deliberate. It creates confusion, panic, and the sense that danger is coming from everywhere at once. In major cities, hundreds are believed to have been killed this way in a single night. Hospital workers describe scenes that defy capacity. Morgues fill within hours. Bodies are stacked in hallways, then moved into prayer rooms, then placed anywhere space can be found. This is not collateral damage. This is volume. When systems designed for emergencies collapse under the weight of casualties, it signals mass killing, not isolated brutality. Inside the country, the narrative is being reshaped in real time. State media has stopped calling protesters unruly or misguided and has begun labeling them as armed terrorists. This shift matters. Language is the final step before justification. Once people are stripped of their civilian identity, killing them can be framed as defense rather than murder. This is how regimes prepare their supporters to accept bloodshed. It is also how they try to turn neighbors against each other, replacing sympathy with suspicion. When words change this fast, it usually means the plan has already been approved. At the same time, the flow of information is being strangled with increasing precision. Satellite internet, once a narrow escape route, is now treated as a direct security threat. Possessing unauthorized satellite equipment is no longer a technical violation. It is treated as an act of subversion. During blackouts, any live signal stands out like a flare in the dark. Locations are flagged, checkpoints tighten, and searches intensify. Entire homes are raided based on nothing more than a detectable connection. As these measures take effect, fewer videos emerge, fewer messages escape, and the outside world sees less, even as the killing continues. Yet even under these conditions, resistance has not disappeared. In some cities, electricity has been cut to plunge streets into darkness, only for crowds to light the night with their phones and continue chanting. In others, ethnic and regional groups have begun issuing statements calling for broader participation, signaling that unrest is no longer confined to one demographic or grievance. This matters because once protests expand beyond a single identity or cause, suppressing them becomes exponentially harder. The regime understands this risk, which is why it is moving with such speed and ferocity now. It is trying to break the moment before it becomes irreversible. What is happening now is no longer just a domestic crackdown. It is beginning to ripple outward, and the regime knows it cannot seal the borders of reality forever. Armed groups on Iran's edges are watching closely, and some are already moving. Kurdish fighters have reportedly begun striking security installations, claiming casualties among regime forces. These are not symbolic attacks. These groups have years of combat experience, gained in wars far from Iranian cities, and they know how to fight organized forces. Their involvement raises the stakes dramatically. Once armed resistance enters the equation, the regime loses its ability to frame everything as crowd control. It becomes conflict, and conflict draws attention, both regional and global. At the same time, millions of ordinary people inside Iran are no longer acting like spectators waiting for outcomes. They are choosing sides with their presence. Even under blackout conditions, even with electricity cut and streets flooded with armed units, crowds continue to form. Phone lights replace street lamps. Chants echo through darkened neighborhoods. This is not chaos. It is persistence. And persistence is what authoritarian systems fear most, because it cannot be crushed in a single night. Every attempt to suffocate it only exposes the scale of force required to keep it down, and that exposure carries its own cost. Outside Iran, governments are watching the numbers climb. Reports of 2,000 killed in less than 2 days are impossible to ignore, even with limited verification. Comparisons to past crackdowns no longer soften the reality. The pace alone marks a turning point. When killing accelerates this quickly, it signals panic at the top. The leadership is acting as if it believes this may be its last chance to regain control through fear. That belief is dangerous because it removes incentives for restraint. If survival feels threatened, anything becomes justifiable, including actions that would once have been considered unthinkable. Signals from abroad are adding pressure. Statements of support for Iranian protesters are no longer vague or symbolic. Discussions are reportedly underway about military options, targets, and consequences. Even the existence of those discussions matters. It forces the regime to calculate not only internal rebellion, but external response. Diplomatic schedules are disrupted. Officials cut trips short and return home abruptly. Movements like these suggest urgency, not confidence. When leadership abandons routine, it usually means something has gone wrong behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the regional environment is heating up. Military strikes against extremist targets nearby send indirect messages that are difficult to ignore. Assets remain positioned, capabilities are visible. The implication is clear. Instability inside Iran does not exist in isolation. Every escalation increases the risk of spillover, miscalculation, or opportunistic action by actors who have been waiting for weakness. The regime understands this, which is why it is trying to end the unrest quickly, before events outrun its ability to manage them. Inside Iran, however, the cost of that urgency is being paid by civilians. Families search hospitals for missing relatives. Medical staff work beyond exhaustion, surrounded by bodies they cannot properly process or identify. Entire neighborhoods live with the sound of gunfire as a constant background noise. Fear is everywhere, but so is anger. And anger, once it replaces fear, is almost impossible to put back into the bottle. This is the transformation the regime fears most, and the very one its actions are accelerating. The blackout, the drones, the snipers, the mass arrests, the language of dehumanization, all of it points to a single conclusion. The state is not trying to calm the situation. It is trying to break it. Whether it succeeds or not will depend on how long people are willing to endure and how much blood the leadership is willing to spill before realizing that force alone cannot rebuild legitimacy once it is gone. The regime is now trapped by its own choices. Every lever it pulls to restore control exposes how fragile that control has become. When electricity is cut, people light the streets themselves. When the internet goes dark, messages still leak out in fragments that are impossible to fully contain. When fear is applied through force, it stops functioning as a deterrent and starts functioning as proof. Proof that the state no longer believes it can survive through consent or even passive obedience. What remains is raw power, and raw power is loud, visible, and costly. Each death adds weight to a moment that cannot be erased, no matter how hard the authorities try to bury it under silence. What is especially dangerous for the leadership is that the violence has removed the illusion of reversibility. Once mass killing reaches this scale, there is no quiet return to normal. There is no version of stability that does not carry memory. Families will remember, neighborhoods will remember, entire generations will remember who fired and who fell. This is why the state is pushing so hard, so fast. It is trying to end the story before it finishes writing itself. But history does not work that way. Stories written in blood do not end when the gunfire stops. They wait, and they resurface when conditions allow. Inside Iran, the sense of time has changed. Days feel compressed. Nights stretch endlessly. People measure events not by dates, but by blackouts, raids, and funerals. The uncertainty is suffocating, yet it has not produced submission. It has produced resolve. When people see that restraint does not protect them, they stop practicing it. That shift is subtle at first, then sudden. The regime is trying to reverse it through overwhelming force, but force cannot rebuild trust once it has been burned away. It can only delay the consequences. The international response, however limited or cautious, is now part of the equation. Even rumors of intervention force recalculations inside the system. Military, political, and economic pressures converge in moments like this, creating fractures where unity once existed. Officials returning home early, emergency meetings, altered messaging, and sudden silence all point to internal strain. A regime that feels secure does not behave this way. It does not shut down an entire country's communication, hunt satellite signals, or deploy snipers against crowds. These are the actions of a system that believes it is running out of time. For the people on the ground, none of this feels abstract. It feels immediate and personal. It is the sound of drones overhead at night, the knock on the door before dawn, the hospital corridor filled with bodies and no answers. The knowledge that speaking too loudly could be fatal, but staying silent feels unbearable. This is the pressure cooker the state has created for itself. The harder it tightens control, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. Eventually, something gives. History offers no examples where this dynamic ends quietly. What happens next is uncertain, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment so volatile. The regime may succeed in suppressing the streets for now, but suppression is not resolution. It is postponement. The anger, the grief, and the loss do not disappear when crowds disperse. They settle. They wait, and when they return changed, hardened by memory and stripped of illusion. The leadership understands this, even if it refuses to admit it publicly. That is why it is acting with such brutality now. It is not confident. It is afraid. The spark this time is not a single headline moment that fades after a few days. It is the grinding collapse of ordinary survival finally turning into rage. The real's fall is not a statistic on a screen. It is rent that cannot be paid, medicine that cannot be bought, and wages that evaporate before they reach a wallet. People are not marching because they believe the system will listen. They are marching because the system has already stopped listening, and silence feels like surrender. When a currency breaks, it breaks trust at the same time, and that is the kind of damage a baton cannot fix. In many homes, the choice is no longer between safety and activism, but between slow suffocation and a dangerous attempt to breathe again. The blackout is not just censorship, it is a chokehold on the machinery of daily life. When networks are cut, card payments fail, cash machines go dead, and salaries cannot move. Businesses cannot restock, families cannot transfer money, and the smallest emergency becomes a crisis because even basic coordination collapses. Reports describe services stalling from airports to hospitals as connectivity flickers or vanishes, turning routine tasks into chaos. The regime wants the country isolated from the outside world, but the isolation lands hardest on people who are already stretched thin. Even people who avoid politics feel the shutdown as empty shelves, stalled deliveries, and a constant sense that the floor under them is moving. This tactic has a cruel logic. If people cannot message friends, they cannot confirm who is alive. If they cannot call relatives, they cannot warn them about raids. If they cannot access services that depend on connectivity, escape routes shrink and checkpoints become traps. The state calls this security, but it functions like collective punishment, a method designed to make protest feel like the cause of every hardship. The problem is that hardship was already the reason people poured into the streets. When the government breaks the tools people use to live, it also breaks the last argument for patience, because patience cannot buy food, fuel, or dignity. Outside Iran, rights monitors are counting bodies and arrests from fragments, hospital contacts, family reports, and whatever slips through the blackout. Their numbers have jumped into the hundreds killed and the tens of thousands detained, even as they warn that the true toll could be higher because verification is deliberately obstructed. One widely cited set of figures puts deaths above 500, with most of the dead listed as protesters, alongside dozens of security personnel and detentions above 10,000. These are not tidy statistics. They are signs of a system using mass force and mass detention as policy, not as an exception. The gap between reported totals and lived reality is itself part of the violence, because uncertainty keeps families terrified and communities disoriented. The regime is trying to seize the emotional narrative by staging funerals on state media and calling fallen security forces martyrs, building a picture of a nation under siege rather than a society in revolt. It is a calculated swap. Replace images of wounded civilians with images of uniformed coffins, then demand loyalty as a form of grief. This is not only propaganda, it is mobilization, a way to keep loyalists angry, armed, and ready to obey. But it also reveals fear. A government that believes it still owns the future does not need to perform grief so loudly in the present. It is also a warning to insiders. Loyalty will be rewarded, hesitation will be punished, and neutrality will be treated as betrayal. Iran's judiciary has sharpened its language into something closer to a threat than a legal warning, saying there will be no leniency for those accused of helping enemies of the state. That phrase is designed to swallow everything: a protest sign, a shared video, a ride to a demonstration, a bandage offered to a stranger. It turns ordinary acts into crimes by association, so punishment can be sold as national defense. Reports describe the push for expedited handling and severe consequences in the name of fighting a so-called all-enemy campaign. Once law is used like a club, it teaches everyone that rights are not protections but traps, and that lesson spreads faster than any official decree. International pressure is rising because the crackdown is too visible to ignore, even through the blackout. The United Nations Secretary General has publicly urged maximum restraint and emphasized basic rights to expression and peaceful assembly. European leaders have condemned what they call disproportionate force and a heavy-handed response, signaling that the world is documenting what Iran is trying to hide. These statements do not stop bullets in real time, but they matter in the next stage, when accountability becomes a fight over records and credibility. They also lay groundwork for future accountability, because the world's record-keeping continues even when Iran's networks are forced into silence. The leadership answers that pressure with its oldest script: blame foreign powers, warn of retaliation, and claim the unrest is a manufactured plot. Iranian officials have openly threatened that American and Israeli interests could become legitimate targets if outsiders intervene. This posture is meant to deter, but it also drags the crisis toward a wider edge where one incident, one strike, one misread signal could explode into something bigger. A government that feels stable does not need to gamble with threats like this. It uses them when it wants to look strong while it feels weak. Every threat aimed outward is also aimed inward, telling citizens that protest will be answered not only with repression but with national crisis. Reports from major outlets describe Washington weighing options that range from cyber measures to military strikes, while also stressing the risk of regional escalation. The details matter less than the fact that they are being discussed at all, because discussion changes the psychology of everyone involved. It gives hardliners inside Iran a justification for harsher repression, claiming they are fighting a foreign-backed assault. It gives protesters a reason to believe their suffering is not invisible. The regime's nightmare is a spotlight it cannot switch off, because attention turns secret violence into documented violence with names attached. There is also a fight inside the state over how to frame this crisis without revealing weakness. Iran's president has spoken in two voices, offering lines about addressing public concerns while endorsing action against what he calls rioters. That is not balance. It is strain. Leaders try to appear reasonable to citizens, while reassuring security forces that repression will be protected from consequences. But when the streets are full and the casualty reports climb, the middle ground becomes a trap. Too soft for hardliners, too harsh for the public, too late to be trusted by either. That strain shows up when officials contradict each other, when promises of reform coexist with orders for force, and when nobody can fully own the outcome. The blackout creates economic damage that feeds back into the security response in ways the regime cannot fully control. When commerce freezes, supply chains slow, and daily transactions fail, the sense of national paralysis becomes obvious. People who never joined a protest still feel the shutdown in their pockets and their stomachs, and that can expand the circle of resentment. Some reporting notes internal debate about the economic toll of a prolonged blackout because the longer it lasts, the more it looks like the government is breaking the country to save itself. If the shutdown stretches on, paralysis becomes a daily referendum on competence, and incompetence is the kind of weakness that invites defiance. Beyond Iran's borders, diaspora communities are trying to keep the story alive with demonstrations and public pressure, using the freedom of distance to amplify what people inside Iran cannot safely say. These rallies do not replace action on the ground, but they matter because they keep foreign governments from pretending the crisis is too complex to address. They also build records, names, timelines, and evidence trails that survive blackouts. The regime counts on the world moving on attention drifting to the next crisis. These external crowds also serve as witnesses, collecting stories that survivors inside Iran may not be able to tell until long after the gunfire fades.